can you be masculine in isolation, or does it require these relationships to express that masculinity?
I certainly think that saying that somebody can't fully be a man without certain forms of relationship seems like that would exclude a lot of people that we would really want to consider very manly, right? So, for example, to say like you're not a man unless you have a wife means that all the celibate priests, Maximilian Kolbe, whom I guess Sohrab Ahmari writes about in his book, that this guy that went to his death to defend the life of the weak that he was with in the concentration camps, right? That seems like a man's man, right? And so I don't think that you can't be a man unless you have these relationships. I mean, it's very important here, I think, to distinguish between kind of the sort of conventional life path for a man that probably works and is good and healthy for a lot of men, and then the things that you can't be a man without. So most men, I believe, are going to be happy, fulfilled, and healthiest if they are married to a woman, giving birth to children, and cultivating a family. And that's where their masculinity can find fullest expression. But I don't think that it means necessarily that you can't be, the truest self that you are and the truest man that you can be without following exactly that life path. I mean, something that we actually really haven't talked about that much at all during this time yet is individuality and selfhood, right? Because we've been talking about a category of person, that is the man. But we haven't talked about the fact that just as that is expressed in different ways at different times throughout history, it also seems to me to be manifested in different ways, unique ways in each individual person. And some men, for example, are fantastic hunters. Some men are fantastic fighters, and the lack of each other's qualities doesn't really make them more or less manly, right? There's different kind of versions of this type, and this is a feature. If you do, like me, you do believe in something like forms, then you believe this is one of the helpful things they help you to do, is account for something that's recognizably the same, a class of thing or people or species, without saying that every version of that has to be identical. Now, I think all men are sons, right? I mean, I've been hard pressed to find a counterexample to that. So being a good son, honoring your parents, seems to me to be kind of bound up in manhood, at least from the biblical perspective. One of the things about nature, when we talk about natural life, right, is that it gives us certain non-negotiables. If I don't believe in nature, then it's not a problem for me that I have people who happen to be related to me by birth, right? That doesn't make them any different from anybody else. Like they're all just these kind of monads, these atoms bouncing around off each other. Andrew and Ellen are not any different from Bob, Sue, and Smith. If I believe in nature, then the historical fact of Andrew and Ellen having been the people who produced me biologically, and then also in time raised me, right? That establishes certain obligations that I have to meet, that I can't escape. And that means that, to be most fully myself, I have to acknowledge my relationship and honor my relationship with those people. Now, I'm talking about all of this as if it were like some sort of chore. In fact, it does seem to actually be the stuff of life, right? I mean, this is one of the funny things, is that we talk about this stuff as if it were annoying to us sometimes, like, oh, I got to call my mom on Friday or whatever. But I do think there's something essential about that, that if you want to really give a full account of what it is to be a human being, just full stop, it's essentially relationally. We're essentially in relationship with one another, and we can't like escape that or do away with it, I don't think.
Very well said. Thank you. Michael, what do you think about that?
I think we see the contrasts. If you look at the first few chapters of Genesis in the Bible and you compare it to something like the Republic, the family is so central right off the bat, your parents and your generations and all of that. Whereas in the Republic, one of the first things that happens is that the father gets chased out of the conversation. And the discussion about the common good, about justice, about the best human life, it can only take place when the parents are out of the way to a certain extent. And there's not a lot of reminiscence there about who they are or what they did. It's just that they need to go. They represent an old piety that's an obstacle to free inquiry. And if free inquiry is what's best in man, then the parents are more of an obstacle as far as that particular activity goes. Another thing is that in the Republic, the person who's been trained as a philosopher, who's undergone gymnastic and music education, and we can say philosophical education, he least of all suffers from the death of a family member, Socrates says in the conversation, because he knows that human life is no great thing. And his relationships are somehow weakened by his contemplation of all time and all being, as Socrates also says later in the book. So to a certain extent, I live as though family is all important to a certain extent. Okay, my parents, myself as a parent, my kids, my wife, all of that, and the tradition that I have inherited, the Jewish tradition. But as a philosopher, when you turn to those texts, you see that somehow the philosopher stands alone when he's at the peak of his activity. He stands alone with his friends, maybe, but they're only his friends because they're also, concerned about that peak activity. His sons were not there by his side when he died. His wife was not there by his side when he died. He's discussing the eternity of the soul with his friends. That's a totally different model, a totally different vision. Not about what we have in common, families and all of this, but about what's outstanding in the human being. If what's outstanding is your family by your bedside, that's one thing. If what's outstanding is the eternity of the soul with your friends, that's another thing. And they're not necessarily compatible. They're not necessarily reducible one to the other. And both of them have a claim on our attention. Socrates gives us a model, I think, of somebody whose relationality at its peak is freely chosen towards friends who merit his attention.
I'm struck by this description of the philosophers kicking the parents out of the room, the dad out of the room to talk about wisdom and such. And then,
sorry, let me just say, I'm sorry.
No,
Jack,
go ahead,
sorry.
Mike.
He doesn't kick him out of the Socrates. He asks some inappropriate questions, or he sort of twists Cephalus's arm to a certain extent. We won't go through all the details. I know Spencer's been teaching the Republic as well. I just don't want to make it seem like Socrates is not so indecent that he would kick the father out. But the conversation only gets going when the father realizes he doesn't really care about a philosophical analysis of justice and piety. He just cares about fulfilling his ancestral duty, doing the sacrifices that he has to do. But that teaches us something about the relationship between ancestral piety, which you might think is like a biblical tradition, and philosophy, which we have represented in the Republic. So I didn't want to give Socrates, I didn't want to smear him by suggesting he kicks the father out of the room. So I just had to clarify that.
Great. Spencer, any comments on this? Guys, we had like 3 other huge things to talk about, and we've been digging really far deep into this. So I'm just sort of going with the flow here. Spencer, I'm sure there's great comment to follow up.
Well, yeah, I'm glad you returned to my old pal Cephalus, for whom I have a lot of sort of sympathy and affection. And so this whole conversation in the Republic, it's imagined, takes place overnight after this festival. Socrates was just on his way home, and then these guys kind of come up and buttonhole him and say, "No, we'd like you to stay at our place." And he gets roped into, as he does, this elaborate conversation about the nature of justice. And not only does the father, who seems to be the only kind of elderly, I mean, he's approaching, it's said that he's kind of on the road, he's just crossed the threshold of older age. He's the only person, it seems, who represents that in any way, who represents age or tradition. Or not only does he get sort of removed early on from the conversation, but then one of the famously most troublesome and vexatious parts of the ideal state that the interlocutors then create is that children will be held in common, wives will be held in common. In fact, all of these given ties will be dissolved, at least among the cream of the crop, among the elites who run the city. This is the guardians, right? And an essential part of their education, of their qualification to rule, of their, just sort of preparation for doing any of this at all, for being in charge, is that they do not have any kind of unique personal obligations that might bias them or dispose them in one way or another. And I think it's a really great point that there is contained in all of that a vision of the philosophical life and a vision of the sort of justice, in which we might say are the seeds for all of this kind of postmodern project. And I don't think that we have to thereby jettison the Republic or have a low view of Plato. I think we can just identify the truth, which is that, that this postmodern project is inherently, inescapably a product of the West, just as much as anything else that we might read or enjoy. Not in the sense of being great. I don't think that Judith Butler belongs on your bookshelf alongside Thucydides. But I do think that, there are recognizably Western, even kind of post-Christian impulses in all of this stuff. And our contention is not that that's kind of somehow, in fact, what we're saying is basically these people are more indebted to the past than they think they are. And that's part of why they're so wrong, right? Is that there is a sense that we've broken free of all of that. But really all we're doing is kind of doing weird arabesques on partially digested or misunderstood impulses that come down to us from centuries of Western philosophy. That's one thing. The other thing is that, and you indicated this too, Michael, right? That Cephalus leaves because he kind of has his answers to the questions that are on the table, and he sort of views what will ensue as a very, very long young man's game. He's a little tired, it's late, and he almost takes for granted what justice is. It's giving to people what you owe, right? And Socrates, one of the really interesting things here is that Socrates isn't hostile to that view. He's just not satisfied with it. So he sort of hears that this is it's a common understanding. Cephalus quotes Pindar, who's a kind of beloved poet, so it's this folk wisdom that he's got. Just this is sort of what I think justice is. And Socrates, I think, ends up with something that incorporates elements of that, right? The famous sort of definition is to give to each what is his due, suum cuique, right? This is what will become the heart of justice, But there are a lot of questions that he wants to ask of the kind that we've been asking now, right? What's the essence of this thing? What about in this situation? What about in that situation? And I actually find that a kind of moving model for philosophy. I do think that by and large, philosophy is a young man's game. That's why we talk about people in their dorm rooms, like smoking blunts and asking whether the universe is actually just a flea walking across the head of a turtle. There's a certain element at which, at a certain age, we're all philosophers. We want to hammer out these things, and then besides those of us who are kind of philosophers professionally, right? Then these questions kind of get answered for you by life. And at a certain point, you have these, and there is, even in the most hard-nosed philosophers like Aristotle from the Greek world, right? There is this idea, it's called doxography, that you kind of take what people say about something or what the general opinion is, and you test out. It's like it's not enough to just sort of take that for granted, but that is a starting point. And sort of Cephalus is a starting point. You sort of say, well, is that quite right, and what parts of it aren't right, and how do we edit and change these parts of it? So I agree that, Michael, that there's something weirdly a-relational about Socrates. Something, I mean, and this is true of Jesus too, in his more sort of imperious moments, right? Who is my father and my brother? It is he who does my word, right? Who is my mother? Your mother is outside waiting for you, say Jesus' disciples to him, and he says, this is my mother, this is my father, all these people who are here to do my will, to listen to my words, right? But I think that, in Jesus, just as in the tradition, right, that has to be counterbalanced with the fact that he also does have personal attachments and friends, and we do have parents, and these, our intuitions, I think, we kind of go wrong when we take from that we need to just abandon that stuff and leave it in the dust behind us. So I keep coming back. I really like this kind of two atoms view, or whatever you want to call it, of superimposing these two things onto one another. They're very different. They might even be at base, in principle, kind of irreconcilable, and yet you have to hold them in tension sort of all the time.